Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this evening's lecture program on behalf of Victoria Memorial Hall on Vivekananda, a new vision. And as speaker for this evening, we have Ruth Harris from All Souls College, University of Oxford, not a newcomer here and not a stranger to many of you here. Uh, Before we get underway with the lecture, may I request all of you to kindly check whether your mobile phones are on silent mode or switched off. That would be a great help. And if you have already taken a minute to do that, I would like to invite Dr. Joyanta Sengupta, Secretary and Curator of Victoria Memorial Hall, to come here, welcome the audience, introduce the speaker, and then pass on the microphone to the speaker for the evening.
Thank you so much, Raju, and good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's lecture on Vivekananda, A New Vision by Professor Ruth Harris, whom it's an absolute privilege and honor for us to host in the Victoria Memorial Hall tonight. Professor Harris, as Raju just said, is no newcomer to the VMH, which she has visited before as a scholar looking for material and ideas, but this is the first time we have the opportunity to hear her speak on one of the most influential figures of modern Indian history, on whom she has written a widely acclaimed new book, Guru to the World, The Life and Legacy of Vivekananda, which was published by Harvard University Press in October 2022. That book is the latest embellishment to a distinguished career of research and publishing in modern European history, transnational history, comparative intellectual history, and many others. Professor Harris, as you know, is currently a senior research fellow at All Souls College and professor of modern history at the University of Oxford. She has been awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship for Research in French History and the Wolfson History Prize for her previous work. In 2011, Professor Harris was elected a Fellow of the British Academy, FBA, the UK's National Academy for the Humanities and the Social Sciences. She has published widely in the history of science and medicine, history of gender and religion, and the history of politics and emotion. Among her many publications, I will just mention the books Murders and Madness, Medicine, Law and Society in fin de siècle, which was published by Clarendon Press, Oxford in 1989. Lourdes, Body and Spirit in a Secular Age, published from Alan Lane in 1999. The Man on Devil's Island, Alfred Dreyfus, and the Affair That Divided France, also published by Alan Lane in 2010. Her edited book, The Art of Survival, Essays in Honor of Alwyn Houghton, published from Oxford in 2006, and the recent book on Vivekananda, of course. In 2017, she delivered the G.M. Trevelyan Lectures in the University of Cambridge, and she has long been a member of the editorial board of the famed journal Past and Present. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Ruth Harris to speak on Vivekananda, A New Vision. Ruth.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joyanta. Before I hand over the microphone to Professor Ruth Harris, may I request Joyanta to kindly hand over a memento on behalf of Victoria Memorial Hall to Professor Ruth Harris.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out. I'm really honored to be here. I never thought I would be here. This book has taken me many years to write because I knew so little about what I was trying to think about. And so I had to start from scratch, which is quite a humbling experience for a scholar. And the reason why I'm so happy to be here is because when I'm asked to give talks on Vivekananda in Britain or in the United States, I have to do a lot of throat clearing. I have to start off by saying who he was and then go on to talk about why he is important. So it's simply wonderful that I can take for granted that such an introduction is not necessary here. But the underlying question remains nonetheless. The argument in my book is that Vivekananda must and should be seen as one of the seminal figures of the global 19th century. But the pattern of his fame does not in any way match that of his influence. In the West, if you ask anyone on the street, the only Indian they'll have heard of is Gandhi and perhaps Nehru. Here, he is a household name. In the West, very few of them have even heard of him. So why this is the case goes to the heart of his life, his ideas, and his program, and why I wrote the book. And today it isn't when I say a new vision that I am offering a new vision. It's a new vision with a question mark. I have no claim to offer anything that new. It's merely an interrogative. Today, what I want to understand is why such different publics as respectable New Englanders and Swadeshi terrorists honored him. With the title of my book, Guru to the World, I did not want to reinforce the tired story of Vivekananda as the first global guru who unlocked Eastern spirituality for the materialist West. In fact, I reject the whole idea of Vivekananda as a New Age guru. Although I chose the title deliberately, I wanted to query this view rather than reinforce it. I, too, want to talk about Vivekananda's relationship to Hinduism, nationalism, anti-colonialism, and karma yoga, but I want to depart from the constraining vision of him as a Hindu revivalist. Instead, I want to combine the Indian Vivekananda with the global guru that Westerners and many Indians as well came in the late 19th century to venerate as the epitome of Indian spirituality, tolerance, and universalism. I'll have time later to go back to the notion of tolerance and how he used it. I insist that there's only one man, a figure endlessly responding to circumstance and milieu, and reacting on the hoof to different audiences. I will not be talking about Vivekananda and his importance to present-day India. Instead, what I'm trying to do, because it's my vocation, is to bring to life the late 19th century world that he inhabited. It is hard to recapture the currents of fin de siècle globalism when Boston ladies in their drawing rooms read Max Muller's Sacred Books of the East, and English-educated Calcuttans read the American transcendentalist Ralph Waldo Emerson, as Vivekananda did, and eminent scientists took spiritualism seriously. Science, religion, and the occult swirled in eddies that flowed into one another, and the conversations they provoked were all the more interesting and sometimes trenchant precisely because of the surging anti-colonialism. Above all, Vivekananda and his audiences everywhere envisaged India through the Orientalist distinction between Eastern spirituality and Western materialism, the latter on extravagant display at America's Columbia Exposition. Oops, let's see. There we go. Oh, there we go. And I'm going to step away from the microphones. Can you still hear me?
No, but we are recording.
Oh, okay. I'll go back to the microphones. But you'll see here in this picture that what I find so extraordinary about it, I'm going to indulge myself with some asides. It's remarkable for its beaux-arts extravaganza. The fake Venetian canals, none of which exist any longer. The only building on the center of the exposition that was not from the West or from America was, of course, the Japanese Houdin. And that is important because it's exactly a vision of the world that marginalized and made peripheral many other parts of the globe. It's not surprising, and at this place, it was not just to capture this idea of America as the new world power. After all, this was the fifth 500th anniversary of Columbus's supposed discovery of America, it was also done with enormous palaces to agriculture and technology.
You can use this.
Thank you. Okay. But this vision of the spiritualist East and the materialist West meant that Vivekananda had to fight against stereotypes and prejudices. But these were the very oppositions that permitted his entry into American and British circles, as he deployed them to insist on India's unique importance for global culture. I want to show how he asserted the value of different universalisms. We know it as Hindu universalisms, but I'll explain that there were more than those, to those promulgated in the West, and to suggest that they were almost as various as the diversity that he treasured as central to India. Now, I would never say that Vivekananda came up with a seamless philosophy or system. Far from it. Instead, he challenged Western hegemony and attempted to make people, both in India and the West, think outside the box. In the 1890s, he articulated a powerful critique of the claims of Christianity to be the sole religion of redemption. Now he of course wasn't the first Indian to do that, but he did so before an enormous Christian audience and on their own turf, while also rejecting atheist claims that science would replace spirituality. Now let's take his famous appearance at the World Parliament of Religions. This is the picture we all know. He takes the podium and in every way rejects the stereotypes of both Indians and Westerners by not looking like anybody they've ever seen. The scarlet tunic, by the way, something that he devised with the help of his New England Yankee friends. The turban comes from the Rajah of Khetri. He already had it and was wearing it. Meant he resembled neither the wandering sadhu of Orientalist imaginings nor the Western Christian minister in somber black with white collar. And we will see that for the women who engaged with him, it was very important that he was not the dried Protestant minister that they were used to. Rather than being grateful for being allowed to speak at all, he addressed his audience famously as sisters and brothers, not as masters. He does not see Jesus as the only path to salvation, although he readily accepts Christ as an avatara. And that also was something they found quite astonishing. He proclaims instead, quote, "We believe not only in universal toleration, but we accept all religions to be true." Words, bearing, and character all rejected what he regarded as Western fanaticism and the hegemony it claimed. Strangely, Vivekananda's remarks were greeted with wild applause. And I have to say, that's my historical question. Why? Why did they listen to him? Who was this guy? He had no Samaj links. He had a rundown monastery in Varanagore. He was unknown. He had to have an invitation. He had no invitation. He was helped along by somebody from Harvard who met him. Why? Why did they listen? And that's this side of the story that Indians don't understand, I think. Somehow, he tapped into a vein of self-criticism, doubt, and vulnerability within his Western hearers. And in the book, I argue one of the reasons why he sort of understood it was that he himself had already gone through a transformation of doubt through the process of leaving the Brahmo Samaj and reconnecting with much of his heritage through Ramakrishna. Witnesses remember the thrill they experienced when he said that it was a sin to call Christians sinners, and then went on to attack notions of original sin and Calvinist hellfire. His words fell on fertile soil as he spoke to Americans' growing rejection of a punitive God and reconsidered their childhood relationship to the Bible as literal truth. I'll have some time to talk about evolution in a moment. Vivekananda did not, however, shift the views of Orthodox Christians. For them, Indians were heathens who worshipped idols, and he reacted badly when more than once women asked if Indian mothers threw their babies to crocodiles. Can you imagine? That was the question the women kept on asking him. And at first he was polite, and then he would lose it, as you can imagine. If they were not heathens, then Indians were metaphysicians, taken up with a nihilistic transcendental search. Again, more than once, Vivekananda was described as Jesuitical, referring to the intellectual Counter-Reformation priests of Europe to suggest a deceptive, if brilliant, sophistry. Even the famous American philosopher and psychologist William James said that Hinduism was ultimately nothing more than, quote, a sumptuosity of security. And I will return to William James, and I write at length about him because I really do believe there was an important debate going on between these two men that you can see in the pages of James's work that no one has ever really understood. Vivekananda, who had engaged with James, resisted this Orientalist cliche about characterless Indians incapable of dealing with real-world problems. Such remarks perhaps explain why he insisted on so-called practical Vedanta. At worst, Westerners wanted a yogi who could perform magical tricks, not like the Indian snake charmers of American vaudeville. These were just appearing in the 1880s and 1890s in all the major capitals of the Western world. We can understand better now why Raja Yoga, the first yoga manual to be published in English in 1896, concentrated on mental states rather than on, quote, getting occult powers. He deployed his knowledge provocatively by arguing against the separation between religion and science. And this is key. This is not something that Indians associate with Vivekananda, but for me is at the heart of everything that he did, and one of the reasons why I was interested in him and moved from my speciality in French history. He not only rejected Christian exclusivism, but also the universalist claims of the Enlightenment and European rationalism. He welcomed scientific discoveries, especially evolution, thermodynamics, and germ theory. In fact, one of his parables was about bacilli in the World Parliament, if you remember. Yeah. But believed they would confirm ancient Indian spiritual and cosmological truths and become handmaidens to Vedanta. It seems to us, he said, that the conclusions of modern science are the very conclusions that Vedanta reached ages ago, but in modern science they are written in the language of matter. He was perfectly happy for there to be a language of matter, and he encouraged it, but he thought there were other languages, and those are the ones that he specialized in. By the way, there seems to be a lot of anonymous contributions he made to science magazines. So it's also very interesting. He really was reading the important popular science of the era so that he could better adapt his lectures for this American public. He asserted that processes of creation and destruction outlined in evolution were already present in the laws of karma. As you know, Darwin had argued that in any given population, those slightly better adapted to a milieu would succeed more in reproducing. Vivekananda accepted evolution, but not this idea of natural selection, especially for the higher reaches of human thought and morality. And in fact, in the collected works, there's a lovely example of him looking at the animals in the Calcutta Zoo and saying, well, maybe Darwin's right for the lower levels, but I just can't see this for the higher levels of evolution. It's really a very Vivekananda story. But it's not because he was rejecting science. The fact was, the history of natural selection and its proof never came until the 1930s, and he was in good company. Even the co-discoverer of evolutionary theory, Alfred Russel Wallace, maintained that the competition of natural selection did not operate in such areas. In rejecting what became social Darwinism, that's a term that was invented in America in the 1940s, so we use that term now, but that wasn't what it was called in the 19th century. Vivekananda also rejected colonialism and realized that Western science could be used to beat Indians for failing to measure up to European standards in the same way that Christianity was deployed. He wrote that, quote, "The survival of the fittest has furnished every oppressor with an argument to calm the qualms of conscience." Instead, he turned to Patanjali, who had explained, quote, "The true secret of evolution is the manifestation of perfection, which is already in each being." By the way, the Americans love that. That was about self-realization. They warmed to this idea of the essential self as being in tune with their own transcendental ideas, because they already had a very reduced vision of what some notion of the Hindu oversoul or the Atman and the Brahman might have been. And hence, they thought there was something familiar in what he had to say. In London, he once remarked that if a man quotes a Moses or a Buddha or a Christ, he is laughed at, but let him give the name of Huxley or a Darwin, and it is swallowed without salt. With rare insight, he saw that scientific debate could be as full of metaphor, bias, and unacknowledged prejudice as controversies in religion. Science was a vital part of the synthesis he created, but it was not an end in itself. He furthered this belief when he pressed Margaret Noble, whom you know more likely as Sister Nivedita, to work with J.C. Bose to create what they called together Vedantic science. Now, what was it that could have brought these people together? How did they speak to one another? What was the terrain on which they met and shook hands? They all dwelt on the notion of experience. They had rejected, all of them, had rejected conventional Christianity and the rationalist certainties of positivism in favor of the new sciences of mind emerging in psychology. And they turned to Vivekananda for insights on perception, states of meditation, and what he deftly called superconsciousness. What I find interesting about Vivekananda was we know through the correspondence of Nivedita and through James that James's famous Principles of Psychology were published in 1890, were given to Vivekananda, and as usual, he read through it quickly. And you can see in his writings all these, he just absorbs the language of this psychology. The people he dealt with were often avant-garde and alternative, and they listened when Vivekananda insisted that Indian spirituality promoted an experimental template for religious and spiritual universalism. Oops. And there they are. I love this photo. Many of you, I'm sure, have seen it. The reason why I love it is, as usual, he's in the middle. And he's noticeable because he's wearing the turban, but very elaborately tied, and the red coat, maybe the black coat, we can't tell because it's a black and white photo. He's sitting next to, in blurred, the woman Sarah Farmer, who starred at Greenacre, Maine. But there they are, all these Yankees who are very, very straight-laced, and he's the only one, except for some of the younger chaps in the front, and he's the only one sitting there, and also, he's the only one with a smile, you know, it's a certain smile. And that is a very interesting picture because they are all corseted, the women. And it's interesting because he talks a lot about their corsets and why they need yoga. Okay, it's fascinating. So naturally, they saw his ideas through their own spiritual lens. And while he's there, he studies them. And from the very beginning, he's very keen on their embodiment. He already knew of theosophy, of course, and criticized it. He criticized it more and more as the years went by, and when he became more well-known. He was very intrigued by Christian Science, the idea that humanity's suffering was nothing more than, quote, waking dream shadows, a description strikingly like the Maya of Vedanta. Now, that is Mary Baker Eddy. Mary Baker Eddy is his contemporary in America. She's one of the great founders of this religious movement called Christian Science, which again raises the question of the relationship of religion and science. She used the notion of science as a form of discovery, that we did not need to go through the business of dying and being impure, but we could immediately be resurrected like Jesus and walk away from the tomb. Here she is trying to cure someone. We see somebody in the background. And it's very important that you realize that every single one of Vivekananda's female acolytes, the famous ones, they all went through a period of Christian Science. And he actually called them Vedantins. So it was another important bridge. He listened to spiritualist lectures, learned their views on comparative religion, and watched them perform healings. He was largely unimpressed and found them spiritually dry. He said that even young girls speak about metaphysics. He was talking about Protestantism. He also found them physically brittle, though he really admired their virtue and their courage. For this reason, he proceeded to give lessons in yoga under the so-called Swami's pine, and where he hoped to bring both spiritual insight and physical flexibility. And if you read these remarks that he makes about yoga, you can see these are the basis of what will become Raja Yoga within a year. Experience was so important to Vivekananda and his audiences, both abroad and in India, because it shifted attention away from pure intellect and texts to more immediate and personal connections to the divine. It was central to the semi-literate Ramakrishna, who had prioritized his mystical experiences over sacred texts, and in the way William James emphasized it in his groundbreaking Varieties of Religious Experience, published in 1902, the year of Vivekananda's death, a work central to mystical psychology, and as I said, in which Vivekananda was cited, as was Max Muller's badly translated sayings of Ramakrishna. By emphasizing experience, both sides underscored their inner worlds, subjective understandings, and embodied awareness. Their view of religious experience necessarily diverged, however, despite the common terrain. Vivekananda spoke of Advaita, of the paradox of self and non-self, which had, of course, a venerated metaphysical pedigree in India, but which his Western audience had grave difficulty understanding, including me. Nonetheless, in both the East and West, Vivekananda, as well as the Westerners with whom he sparred, be they Harvard professors or theosophists, all agreed that the subject was no longer a free will agent of the dualism of Descartes, but one that recognized that experience signified possibilities beyond the realm of objects and rational deduction. This intuition may explain why feminine experience was often central to apprehending what was deemed beyond the masculine domain of reason. Even William James, had recourse to female mediums in his research. Now, this is a famous fraudulent medium, Eusapia Palladino, and James, who hated any administrative work, became the head of the American Psychical Society because he was actually fascinated by these experiments and was determined to find out who the frauds were. He actually, we think of James as the ultimate pragmatist, the ultimate scientist, but much of his work was done, quote, experimentally with these kinds of women. And of course, for Vivekananda, women were also key in his analysis and of spiritual power. His reliance on women demands a reassessment of what in the West has been called the feminization of religion in the 19th century. Of course, the term conjures up the armies of Christian female missionaries, Catholic nuns, etc., who worked at home and in the colonies. Vivekananda inverted the normal alliances, with Western women opposing Christian missionaries and even becoming anti-imperialists. while Indian female figures became the new saints of the movement. And why this is so important is that if you read Nivedita's biography, you'd think she would have become a missionary. She was the daughter of a Protestant minister. She had many of the parochial Christian views of her culture. She had been a teacher, and yet she ends up being the most radical, one of the radical, not the most radical, but a part of the radical national movement. And it's, again, why is this the case? Why does Sharada Devi become the one that these women admire as they abandon their Christianity? The connections with women were crucial for the way Vivekananda internationalized his enterprise. To succeed, he needed to put together the world of Western activists and alternative spirituality with Hindu wifehood, motherhood, and female sainthood. And as you can imagine, this was very difficult and profoundly at times contradictory. Later, he was troubled that he could not find reliable Western men to support his efforts. And if you want to discuss why that was the case, I can explain. Nonetheless, these women were crucial to creating worldwide Vedanta and central to promoting a vision of India as the world's spiritual teacher. His relationship to the women's worlds was crucial in his changing view of Hinduism. The stories are legendary. Early on, he refused to undertake new ventures without the support of Ramakrishna's widow, Sharada Devi, requiring her permission before leaving for America. He learned about American religion from women and was struck by their moral and intellectual independence, even if later he became more critical. He was welcomed into the unusual world of highly educated Yankee ladies, and there he found novelists, female lecturers, and reformers, women with old Puritan pedigrees, often substantial wealth, and links to Harvard academics and New England theologians. On one level, in my view, I put this in the book too, I think that these women were very new to him. On another level, I think he was used to being amongst intelligent women from his family and from the Bengali notability, you know. So on one level, it was completely new. On another level, he inserted himself very easily. Even though these women had fantasies about the so-called Orient, for most, Vivekananda was their first encounter with a real South Asian. And of course, here is Sarah Bull. She is the wife of the famous violinist Ola Bull. She was his mother, and of course, she's the one who gives the money for the construction of all the first buildings at Bellarmat. And she is also, of course, the one who gives Nivedita enough money to live while she's living in Calcutta. I mean, Nivedita has to give up everything, her family, her livelihood, her independence, and she needed a few rupees to live on in Calcutta, and this is the woman who supplies it. They were astonished by his beauty, intelligence, and wit, and overwhelmed him with curiosity and hospitality. His celibacy enabled a rare social intimacy, which also paradoxically reinforced an image of manly restraint, so important to his self-vision as a renouncer, and he constantly reiterated his special position as a monk. Although the sexual boundary was observed, at times distressing emotional entanglements resulted in hurt on both sides. And of course, the most famous is Margaret Noble. But he also spoke about the difficulty of his personal love and the need to treat everybody the same. He was very open about that. He was very emotional. Above all, and in deliberate contrast to Christian missionaries, he sought no converts. And he distanced himself from formalized church building. And of course, in America, they just couldn't believe that he didn't want to convert. In a Protestant culture that was deeply sectarian, all he said was he wanted to make the Methodist a better Methodist, the Presbyterian a better Presbyterian, the Unitarian a better Unitarian. And they found this astonishing. He sought to exemplify the tolerance that for him was the essence of Hinduism, describing India's welcome of Jews after the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem and the embrace of fleeing Zoroastrians. So he presented so-called spiritual in India at the parliament as an eternal refuge, a portrayal which set aside growing intercommunal rivalry between Hindus and Muslims, as well as untouchability, even though he constantly talked about his anger towards don't touchism. He also importantly sidestepped Pandita Ramabai's concern for the unhappy state of Hindu women. You all know who Pandita Ramabai is. In America, nobody knows who she is, even though she had 86 societies in America when he was there, okay? And she, of course, had converted to Christianity. He was afraid that her critiques would diminish Indians. Because of Western hegemony in India, he remained always on the defensive. His discourse on, quote, tolerance, a word he did not really like, revealed another dimension of an essentialized Hinduism that he internationalized, but it was also vital to his nationalism. This, I suggest, is the profound paradox of claiming to be the guru to the world. It promotes an idealism that distorts self-recognition and complexity on both sides. If the East is spiritual and the West is materialistic, it means that it's very hard, it's a very monolithic category, it's very hard to step outside these constraints of the discourse. However, he always finds a way of doing so, because contrary to the man-making stereotype in India, in America, he said he was a woman amongst women. And this is up there online, and it's something that nobody ever cites. And he, and the women, associated and created experimental relationships that were both life-enhancing and disruptive. And when he came back to India in 1897, he said, if I have to come back again as a woman, I must and will come back as an American woman. He compared their freedoms to the constraints that ruled Indian women, whose condition had been at the center of both reformist and orthodox debate over westernization for decades, and since the big discussion of Sati. And of course, I choose that line because I'm an American woman, so I like that one. Okay, but there's more here than admiration. He admired their moral force, but he was ambivalent about their philanthropy and activism, which he feared would be used against his fellow Indians. He remained wary of coercive Western emancipation, especially for Indian women. He was violently opposed to child marriage, but he was cautious on the subject of widow remarriage, which he regarded as a spiritual death. I simply don't believe he could have envisaged, for example, his own mother marrying again. Brides, he continued to believe, should be subordinate to the son's mother until they became mothers in turn. And he said this in California. He was talking about the mother as the queen of the household. And he also had an exalted view of Sharada Devi, and she was key to how he envisaged the maternal in his theology. But she was, above all, a living spiritual guide. When he returned to India for the first time in 1897, he washed himself in the Ganges before meeting her, so not to contaminate her with foreign corruption. Ordinarily, he derided such rituals as don't touchism, but with her, it was different. He readily cast aside his cloak of enlightenment. Sharada became paramount in his mission because, at least in his eyes, she seemed to square the circle, to be the ideal Hindu woman while also resisting convention, first by continuing to wear her wedding bangles and red-bordered sari as a widow, and later by sharing food with his foreign female devotees. And here she is with Nivedita, of course, but there's a whole discussion about how to share the food, and also, of course, these extraordinary photographs, and the first famous one of Sharada was taken by the Western women, and they had to ask her to take off her veil, and these were all things that were new. After all, she lived in Purna, basically, with her own women, the Zenana. So it was a very complex but moving encounter between these women, and in fact, they came to depend on her more and more. She's very interesting because we have no direct testimony. But there's something that emerges nonetheless. For example, they recount how she's attacked by a mischievous disciple, and she apparently slaps him and holds his tongue to make him stop. I mean, this is a woman who's not a pushover, you know? She helped sex workers against Ramakrishna's wishes and believes she honored him by using her own judgment. And she actually tells the women who are having a very difficult time with these Western women with a guru, how do you square the demands of conscience with your guru's orders? And she doesn't talk about the issue of conscience because she's not interested in that. She's not a Protestant. She instead says, this directly, by using your own judgment, you will honor your guru. And this is they find this extraordinary. It's the most direct advice they've had, and they really use it. After her husband died, she traveled far and wide, counseled the poor and mighty, and she cooked for each disciple individually, and they all talk about this. Of course, this service was also a metaphor for spiritual progress. Each person needed to find a religious path suitable to his or her spiritual constitution. Sharada Devi was esteemed for her practical application of this understanding. Now, he was devoted to her as a saint, and he thought he was never in the same league. But he was also caught by the very idealizations that he created, and he sought another ideal, and he found it in Margaret Noble, the Scotch-Irish woman he called his Celtic lioness. Now, I never really understood what qualities he associated with Celticness. But there's something about radicalism, force. The lioness is certainly about courage. She met him in London, followed him back to Calcutta, and there she Hinduized herself and connected with other global intellectuals in a way that he could not. He never connected with Tagore, but of course she did. She connected with the Japanese art historian and Pan-Asianist Okakura Kakutsu, and of course with J.C. Bose. There are even those who said she wrote the earlier volumes, and he gave her the notes, and that's what she says herself. But there are others who think that she did as well. I don't take a stand on this. He christened her the dedicated one, and she undertook the task of both articulating his world significance and embedding aspects of his theology into a nascent Indian nationalism. Perhaps even more, she pushed the idea of the Indian national idea. Often, especially while in the West, he argued against nationalism, which he saw again as a form of the survival of the fittest. He understood that imperialism was a form of nationalism, and so he questioned it. When in India, Nivedita suggested that she was, quote, the most loyal Englishwoman that ever breathed, he railed at her and called such attachment a sin. Other times, however, his talk of the sacred motherland suggested that he shared this dangerous love of country. She ultimately believed that he exemplified the national idea, but was not its spokesman or theoretician. She thought that she was that, okay. It is true that he often spoke of man-making and the Kshatriya force. But she, not he, developed these ideas after his death. And the term aggressive Hinduism, which is very much to oppose muscular Christianity, is published in 1905 during Swadeshi, which he didn't live to see. For Vivekananda, she was his Basant in the making, and she reshaped his message when he re-embraced Kali worship in 1898 on a pilgrimage to Kir Bhawani in the Himalayas. He wrote famously about Kali's infinite darkness, power for destruction, and love of madness. And when he returned, he withdrew and was no longer interested, quote, in doing good. He even told Nivedita that patriotism was a mistake. I have more to say about Nivedita's fear of this non-self that wanted to sit in the lap of Kali. For now, I'll suggest that her incomprehension was later transformed into a deep appreciation of Kali's power. Remember, for Protestant women, God was a man. They had no feminine godhead. And to have a godhead who was not only feminine, but also aggressive, could be aggressive, as well as maternal, it was quite an extraordinary revelation. She wrote on Kali. She it seems he looked over the text. Vivekananda at one point, there was talk of her revising it, and she said she would only revise it unless he personally ordered her to do so. He never did. He was savvy in finding a forward-looking British woman of education to present Kali's case. After all, Kali worship horrified the Brahmos, and there's remarks about how the Brahmos came to hear and were horrified, and they were delighted. And also such devotion was seen as revealing the so-called lower levels of Hindu worship. Nivedita confronted this view head-on, spoke at Kalighat, where she stated that the great glory of this mother worship lies in his bestowal of manhood. Now, for men like Aurobindo and Bipin Chandra Pal, her book recast Kali from being a symbol of national degeneration into an icon of national dynamism. They thought this her greatest contribution. I want to now revert to the question of whether there were two Vivekanandas. At first glance, it appears that his message altered according to his audience. In the West, he emphasized universality, insisting that Christians recognize the world's diversity. In India, he seemed concerned apparently with the Gita and the biceps, a statement that in fact he made only once, even though it became the rubric by which he is almost inevitably condemned or applauded today. Even if we set aside such stereotypes, he did repeat the man-making message to his monks and in other Indian settings. Was he then, in the end, like his guru Ramakrishna, who was famous for tailoring teaching to each individual? Did he do that then with each audience? I would say yes. I'd also say he was like the Buddha, who used skillful speech to speak differently to different publics. I hadn't thought of this for the book, but I think that it's very important. Certainly, in the West, he preached against materialism, violence, and fanaticism, his national pride focusing on Indian tolerance. He sought to introduce yoga to draw Westerners away from muscular Christianity, from what he perceived as the hardness of their minds and bodies. Against Western brutality, he hoped to teach mildness. Against the busyness of commercialism and punctuality, he asserted the primacy of meditation. Unlike Christian Scientists, he didn't seek miraculous cure, but advised instead perseverance in the search for transcendence. And he scolded, a habit which the Western women found hard to bear. He was not sensitive to the gender dynamics of his time, even his time. But he also criticized what he saw as Western chivalry as a form of sex that hampered women's strength. As much as amongst Indian men, he sought to promote robustness amongst his female acolytes, though he did not call it man-making. Sister Christine recounts how he blew cigarette smoke in her face. And she was appalled because, you don't do that to a genteel woman. But she said then she got it, that it was a lesson about the fact that he wouldn't help her down the rocks and that he wouldn't do this for her and wouldn't do that for her. He's trying to encourage her independence and robustness. But the fact that that there's no other term for it but man-making shows the deep-rootedness of the oppositions. Despite his socially conservative view of women, he surprised them by his listening. And also by what he did for them. He famously ground spices on the floor to make curries, and they had never had a man cook for them. I mean, for them, this was a maternalism that completely moved them. There's just no other word for it. And he had a genuine interest in their religious and effective lives. So this was his technique in the West. What was it like in India? And how did it change his nationalism? He wanted to end what he saw as Indian timidity. Of course, he had to deal with the stereotype of the Bengali Babu, who was opposed to muscular Christianity. This is what he detested. He wanted to shift attitudes of subservience and fear, and above all, to resist imitation. What people don't realize, well, some who really know the stuff, is that when young, he carried the Gita with him when he went on pilgrimage up and down and across India, but he also carried The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis, a 15th century text that urged Christians to withdraw from the world in search of spiritual growth. He valued this book as a manual equal to anything in his own tradition and liked it precisely because the British missionaries in his own world didn't follow it, and he said so. But later, he became more ambivalent about imitation and its suggestion of colonial inferiority. When, for example, he came to the World Parliament, he said, "We need self-respecting differentiation." Quote, "The Christian is not to become a Hindu or a Buddhist, nor a Hindu or a Buddhist to become a Christian, but each must assimilate the spirit of the others and yet preserve his individuality." He labored to understand how one changed while remaining oneself, an existential concern that he returned to throughout his life. Such issues, of course, were personal, but also profoundly cultural and political. How did a people or a nation alter itself or find new sources of strength without surrendering its values and identity? As early as 1894, he wondered if the Indian masses could become Occidental in energy, activism, and equality while remaining Hindu in religion. And what he meant by religion was not just spiritual concerns, but also cultural values. How could India remain open to the world without losing itself in harmful Western ideas? Given these sets of concerns, you can understand why he's so important today. I mean, this is the big question. These are the big questions for everyone all over the world. How were Indians, both as individuals and as a nation, to realize themselves? In California in 1900, he proclaimed, "Religion is not an imitation of Jesus or Muhammad. Imitation is never genuine. Be not an imitation of Jesus, but be Jesus. You're quite as great as Jesus, Buddha, or anybody else." And that's exactly the line he would have said in India and was saying in India, but in a different way to the different audience. Such skillful speech was part of pulling and prodding his audiences to the middle, away from what he saw as the extremes that hampered them. I've suggested that he taught meditation to urge Westerners away from busyness, distraction, and hardness. However, when he returned to India, he constrained his brother disciples and novices with new routines and regulations, the so-called Bellarmine rules. He also, and this is extraordinary, introduced the Delsarte method. Now, this was a system of breath control and expression exercises pioneered by French singing and acting coach François Delsarte. He had mocked this method in the West, and he knew it because he knew all the divas in the West. He knew Emma Thursby, and of course he had contact with Sarah Bernhardt, and he made fun of it because he said, "You shouldn't be doing this, you should be doing the pranayama." Okay, so it's very interesting. He even added training with dumbbells to deepen the physical endurance of his monks in the cause of practical Vedanta. He worried that they wouldn't be strong enough to go out and work in these poor districts. This takes us, in my view, to what in India is regarded as the core of his teaching, practical Vedanta and a revised vision of Karma Yoga. He deployed them in a way that fought against Western stereotypes of Indians as metaphysicians. And this was an argument that at the time was being made to deprive Indians of higher education and science. And you'll see, if you read Nivedita's letter, she records the dialogue between her and Birdwood, who is the British minister. I can't remember exactly who he is. And she's begging for more science, and Tata is willing to give them money. And he says, no, they're metaphysicians. And they can't do science. Speaking of endless, I think the practical Vedanta emerged hand in hand with his hatred of what he called don't-touchism. He hated the endless ceremonials, food prohibition, and bans against caste intermarriage and dining. And he concluded, those whose heads have a tendency to be troubled day and night over such questions simply deserve the name of wretches. And then he went on to argue against, quote, the fictitious differentiation between religion and the life of the world. And of course, he reshaped Advaita Vedanta. For Vivekananda, Advaita proposed unity and solidarity among all human beings, a worship of the divine within, a vision of universality and connection that had seduced his Western hearers. And what's interesting is he did this without abandoning the other kinds of Hindu worship. When he returned to India and people would press him, he said, look, Ramakrishna realized everything through Kali. And he never disowned that. And I think it's very important to acknowledge that even though Advaita was prioritized, he didn't reject other forms of worship. Even today, his vision of Advaita Vedanta may offend the orthodox, while some perceive the practical Vedanta as a betrayal of Ramakrishna, who had warned against philanthropists' worldly desire for name and fame. And if you read the memoirs of some of his beloved brother disciples who remained distressed when they went out to help the famine-stricken at handling money and writing official reports for their efforts, you'll see how hard it was for them to change. But he urged them on. Remember, he gave his famous London lectures on practical Vedanta before his return to India in 1897 in the midst of the horrible hunger that killed 12 million Indians. It shook him to the core. The plague wasn't even as bad as the hunger. He was upset by the plague, but he came back to Calcutta and had a plague manifesto. But the famine pulverized him. His view of Advaita Vedanta also helped him envisage the nation. Again, during his return tour in 1897, he spoke of Indian diversity and believed that the sacred motherlands could only be understood by celebrating the mosaic of culture and religion that comprised it. So-called racial mixing never frightened him, nor did he even ever suggest segregation. He prioritized Advaita for metaphysical reasons, but also because he disliked sectarianism. He proclaimed, one sect has one particular form of ritual and thinks that it is holy, while rituals of another are simply arrant superstition. Advaita, by emphasizing formlessness, asserted that unity existed above particularity. And this was vital to India precisely because of its diversity. Quote, here we have the Aryan, the Dravidian, the Tartar, the Turk, the Mughal, the European, all the nations of the world pouring their blood into this land. He was forthright in recognizing that language, race, or ethnicity could not bring Indians together. And if you wanted to speak about race, I mean, he used race in 10 different ways, like everybody did at the end of the 19th century. But for him, it was primarily not a biological category. Instead, he emphasized an admittedly Hindu vision of Advaitic unity that encouraged all spiritual inclinations to find shelter under its capacious umbrella. This is what I think he meant when he extolled, quote, our sacred religion, our religion as the one common ground. Also, he was acknowledged enmity between Hindu and Muslim brothers, but also believed that fraternity would and should outweigh rivalry and antipathy. Of course, this vision of Advaita prioritized a Hindu idea, a notion of embrace and connection that non-Hindus might resist. His Karma Yoga, as you know, was an explicit program of national rejuvenation that steered between reformist meliorism and reactionary revivalism. He also focused on compassionate and disinterested activism. He wanted the renouncer to retain the otherworldly subjectivity of yore, but now to do so by tackling India's contemporary problems. The sannyasin he maintained was ideally suited to join in life's endless flux while retaining inner stillness. He also encouraged these ideals, as you know, amongst householders. And there was a bit of militancy in his thought. When, after his pilgrimage to Kir Birwani, he wanted nothing more than to sit in the lap of Kali. And as I told you, Nivedita was appalled. His need to experience the non-self by becoming one with the mother frightened her so much that she and her friends literally called the doctor. And I found that very funny. But for Vivekananda, it allowed him to shed the hyperactivity that had distinguished him as America's cyclonic monk. He hated that. I mean, he did it, but he often said that the punctuality was killing him, it was ruining his health, and he often said to his very close friend Josephine MacLeod that what he really wanted to be was back under the tree in Dakshineshwar, listening to Ramakrishna. He was exhausted. This momentary relinquishing of power and plans enabled him to find the detachment he needed to re-enter the fray. By returning to babyhood, he reclaimed unworldliness before re-engaging. And she says, the next day he comes up and he has a list, a series of plans, and they start working again together. Periodically, he showed his radical edge to his Western acolytes, and I'm now coming to the end, when visiting the dungeon cages of Mont Saint-Michel. Now, I don't know if any of you have been here, but this is a beautiful, beautiful place in Normandy. And as you can see, it's a chapel and a fortress that is separated from land by the tides. So sometimes the water comes in and sometimes it doesn't. And when he visited it with all these Westerners, he muttered under his breath, "What a wonderful place to meditate." These prison cells had contained political prisoners under the Bourbons, and he grasped the parallel with British rule in India. And what I find interesting is they're there, they get it, but they don't really get it, because they don't understand that he has this side that's very sharp. He advocated the marshaling of vital energy against tyranny and revealed how the deepest renunciation could also encompass the highest activism. When Aurobindo awaited trial in 1908 in prison, he saw Vivekananda in a vision and urged his comrades to form a yogic form of revolutionary asceticism, a new kind of lila, or divine play, that entailed self-control, moral strength, and physical endurance. They became Krishna in the prison house. While Vivekananda used the middle way to urge his hearers away from extremes, the militant edge remained. And I think he mostly used the middle way, but the militant edge was there as well. This explains why, in my view, over a generation ago, people came to socialism on the left through Vivekananda. And today, it inspires the more radical on the right. For these reasons, Vivekananda is a movable feast. You can always find something in Vivekananda. Provocative, undoubtedly significant, but infinitely faceted. But because he died at 39, we can never truly know what his future course might have been. He did not even live to see Swadeshi. Thank you very much.
Take a few questions.
I'd love to take questions.
Maybe you can sit down and.
No, I don't need to sit down, but I actually
Yeah, we
prefer
can
to-
move.
Can you hear me?
Hello, yeah.
I'd rather stand up. Are there any questions? There must be some questions. Yes, go ahead.
Well, thank you, madam, for your magnificent, your entire presentation was like the Himalayas. We appreciate the mightiness and grandness of the Himalayas. Your presentation was exactly, grand, magnificent as the Himalayas. And it also, like Maharaj Bhagirath, he had brought the Ganges down to earth. Your speech, you seem that, in your presentation was you brought the Ganges of knowledge down to us, from the, Bhagirath brought it down from the matted locks of Lord Shiva. You brought it down from Swami Vivekananda, this knowledge of Ganges. And your presentation, seemed that like exact what Vivekananda wanted, man-making. Combination of the head, heart, and the hands, work, hands standing for work. So your presentation was just not, an intellectual presentation. You spoke with all your heart. And of course, the work, the monumental work you did, is something grand, It's a continuation of all the research in the West on Vivekananda, starting from Christopher Isherwood, Aldous Huxley, and then, of course, Sister Nivedita, Sister Christine, latest, I think, Sister Gargi, Mary Louis Bouquet, Barke, I think, yeah. Yours the continuation of it. So, I don't have much questions, but one thing I would like to mention was regarding the widow marriage. When Bengal was torn on the question of widow marriage between the conservatives and the liberals led by Vidyasagar, he was asked his opinion. Vivekananda said, am I a widow? Why are you asking? Are you silly? Then he said the widows need to be given the spiritual education, proper spiritual and material education, that they would decide for themselves.
That's
He was
right.
very much against men deciding for women. And that was another question is regarding the you emphasized on women power and Swamiji's teachings, but do you think it comes from the old ancient Indian idea of women being a embodiment of Shakti, which needs to be awakened? If that Shakti, when a woman can be awakened, that would work miracles, and that would be more powerful than one man could achieve. But once he said that if 500 men can conquer India in so many days, 50 women can do that. So do you think, that was my question regarding, this, his idea of women power. And another question was, do you think that regarding America, he said, he had given deep appreciation for America. He said that Ashoka's council was only a group of Buddhists. Akbar's was more broad-minded, but still it was only a parlor lobby. It was for America to declare to the world that God, the divine, exists in all religions and in all human beings. So do you think he had deep appreciation for America?
Oh, I can answer all three questions. Thank you very much. Can you hear me, everyone? Okay. The story of the widows, it's very interesting because, again, he says different things in different places. But, and as I said, in 1900, it is true that he even with the stuff on child brides, he told his fellow disciples, I don't want you to be with anybody who supports child marriage. He was more ambivalent about the question of widows, but what you say was true. He wanted not just spiritual education, but education for women tout court. Yes. But the question was, he brings Nivedita over. She starts a school for girls, right? And then she leaves it within a few months, literally within a year, because she hates it. And because her best pupils are getting married at 12 and 13. So it seems that at different points, he recognized, yes, he really did believe that women ultimately should decide, but they needed the education. But the question of how they were going to get that, given the state of most Indian women, those were practical issues that he stepped aside. And I can see that. I think he was so overwhelmed by this question. He had sisters. As you know, I think one of the great and misunderstood aspects of his life is that his own sister, Jolene Trabala, she committed suicide. And it hurt, terribly. And there are moments when he talks about what he wants to do for the sacred motherland, but there are other moments when he says, I'm just here for bhakti, for love of family, for my sisters, So yes, I agree with what you're saying, but I also think that's not where his activism focused. And when he had people like Ramabai in the conversation, he concentrated on the Indian masses. And when he thought of the Indian masses, he thought of the men, not the women. So it's a little bit tricky, that one. He writes right away that he's found in America amazing examples of the power of Shakti, and that America was a happy country because of the way they treated their women. But then the question then becomes later, he's not as keen either on them or on the women, on America as he was in the beginning. For example, when he talks about American politics, and they use the word freedom, he thinks their notion of freedom is very bounded. And he says they don't know what they're talking about. There's nothing in their vocabulary that can express the release of the kind of freedom, of the moksha that he's trying to convey to them. And so he finds their notion of freedom, the notion of the pursuit of happiness. He hates that. He hates the pursuit of happiness. He hates when people tell him, you should teach people to be good, because he's constantly trying to explain to them that there's a way of regarding the cosmos that encompasses a relativity that we cannot, from the position of Maya, understand. So he keeps on giving them these parables, things like fire is good if it heats your food, if it cooks your food, but it's bad if it burns your house down. Do you see what I mean? So, and then people criticize him that he's a moral relativist, but that isn't true. He just doesn't concentrate on transgression. Do you see what I mean? He concentrates on realization and these levels of understanding that he's trying to convey. And he's really working against different traditions. Okay, so yes, of course, he's obsessed with Shakti, and the re-engagement with Kali, in my view, is also a re-engagement with his guru. He's back in India. You know, in America, he chants, but he virtually doesn't sing. And I found this really upsetting because he constantly sees singers and goes to hear singers. They hear him singing in the back in California, but he doesn't sing publicly because I think he's very worried about presenting himself in a feminine way. But of course, if you read the Kathamrita, one of the keenest connections between him and Ramakrishna is the singing. And there's a whole world. They talk about how he comes back into amongst the Guru brothers and starts singing Kalidasa again. And you know, he recovers those sides of himself that he loses in America. But in America, because he's not in India, he can be a woman. Do you see what I mean? Because in India, he can't be, even though he has Ramakrishna as a guru, because he'll be accused of being an effeminate Bengali babu. Do you see? So he's constantly, what I find so interesting about Vivekananda is his insistence on retaining the different aspects of himself. And this is my way, in a modest way, of going against the idea of the intimate enemy. You know, that there's an idea that he accepted, and you know, he internalized Kipling and imperialism. No. What he does is he's sick. It's so much work to try to keep the pieces together. That's why he dies at 37. He's constantly running, he's constantly traveling, and he's ill all the time with diabetes and kidney, and they have no idea what to give him, and everybody's giving him different foods. And you know, the last pictures of him up in Shillong, he's puffed up. He's blind at certain times because of the diabetes. Do you see what I'm saying? But it's not that he gives up himself. It's just it's hard to be himself in an imperial world. That's what I'm trying to say. You know, he's trying constantly to address everybody as equals, and at the same time, he's so frustrated with his Indian compatriots because he wants them to get moving. You know, it's both sides constantly. So that's what I really think is going on. Okay. Thank you for the 3 questions. Yes. No.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I didn't see you. I shouldn't have done it. Sorry. I shouldn't interfere.
Thank you for your elaborate speech regarding the new vision of Swami Vivekananda. My question is, I come to know the name of Sarabul. Sarabul, who was she, and how can she become the godmother of Swami Vivekananda? Can you details in details?
Yeah. Oh, it's a very interesting story. I mean, she's one of the rare women who already has known a South Asian. She knows Mohini Chatterjee. Yeah. So she has basically a Brahmo theosophical guru before Vivekananda. Mohini Chatterjee teaches her the Gita. And he writes this manual where it's the Gita in, I put it side by side, but he footnotes the Bible. And this is, again, the universalism. So she's already been there. But she's been through everything. She's been through mind control, Christian Science. She was extremely active in spiritualism and tried to contact her dead husband. And of course, and then when they try to study her, the Psychical Society, these are the Americans, she rejects it. She already acknowledges that the occult is dangerous. And this is a position that Vivekananda would hold. And by the way, even after he died, they still kept on doing this because it's part of the culture, and they know many Indians who do it. You see, so it's a part of a global thing. Yeah, and it's important for theosophists. But anyway, what happens is she becomes highly devoted to him, and she's particularly devoted to her because she has an estranged daughter, and Vivekananda really helps her, and helps her to see it as a sadhana, and I don't think anyone else did. And of course, she devotes her life to the movement, and in the end, if you read the last chapter of my book, it's a very tragic story, what happens to her. She has pernicious anemia, and she dies very, very hard. So it's a long story, but each one of the stories of the women are fascinating because they're such unusual people. But he doesn't only operate with upper middle class people, but he mostly does, very educated ones. But he also, he for a moment pulls away from her because she wants him to be with the right people. After all, she has a salon. She invites William James. All these Harvard professors are her friends. She prints his lecture that he does at Harvard and makes sure that everybody gets to read it. She has lots of money, lots, But he says to her, "Don't interfere with me." He goes to New York and he lives in a much poorer neighborhood, and he invites all kinds of people to teach. But in the end, it's amazing. If you look at Bellarmine, the land is bought by a disciple named Henrietta Muller, who goes back to Christian theosophy. She doesn't stay with him. And Sarah Bull provides the buildings, the early buildings. And it's already international, Bellarmine. That's the whole thing. And there's something remarkable because he says he's a terrible organizer, but he must have had something to get all of this organized because it's big money. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ruth. That's absolutely fascinating. I have one quick question and one comment. Now, I think what I found really fascinating that what you have tried is not an intellectual biography as such, but it's a very diachronic view of Vivekananda or the rise of the Vivekananda phenomenon as an evolving historical moment. In which, and the many aspects of his personality, a movable feast, as you said, they are sort of connecting with these crisscrossing currents of cultural, intellectual, spiritual thought, and they all converge in the time that Vivekananda is living. So that's a very dynamic and diachronic view of Vivekananda, and absolutely fascinating. And I was just wondering what would be your views on the possibilities of writing similar books on other Indian figures, and the name that immediately comes to mind is Tagore, because he is also known as Gurudev, and he is
absolutely
somewhat well known in a world, and from the 1860s down to the down to 1941, his life is also passing through these big processes like empire and nationalism and Swadeshi and world wars, everything. And to some extent, like Vivekananda, he's also viewed in different parts of the West as a sort of personification of a saint or even a god with his flowing beard and long robe and so on and so forth. So, would you say that the way forward in sort of recalibrating our biographies or our studies of such important personalities is to place them in a bigger, evolving, dynamic picture of historical moments? So that's your quick thought on that. The other is, I find this not really intriguing, but I think it's important to mention that Vivekananda doesn't live on to see Swadeshi, but someone who does is his youngest brother, Bhupendranath Dutt, who was this revolutionary and goes to jail for sedition. and then sort of flees to the US.
Yeah.
And becomes various things, becomes a sociologist, an anthropologist, a communist, and then escapes to Germany. But the interesting thing, he also, he is one of Vivekananda's acolytes, of course. And he writes his biography of his, what's prophet, something called the,
Prophet Patriot.
yes, exactly. Yes.
I have to read this all, yeah.
So it's a biography which is full of admiration. But he also happens to be somebody who, after coming back to India, writes a 2-volume account in Bengali of America, which is called My Experiences of America, which is not a personal memoir, but a critique of American society, especially of capitalism and race. And I think, I have been looking a bit into this, and I think that is perhaps one of the first critiques of American society from anybody in the global South.
Interesting.
Yes. So how would you reconcile that with Vivekananda's own perception of American society as something that can, they have many things, but there are also limits to it. So your quick comments on the Bhupendranath case, and what's our way forward with writing these studies on personalities?
Well, the first question is very close to my heart because the book, there are two things I wanted to accomplish in the book. The first was not to do a conventional intellectual biography because a conventional intellectual biography is so one-dimensional. He was so not that way. And also, I decided to write the biography not only about him as traversing these currents, which he did, but also as a biography within a biography within a biography, because it begins with Ramakrishna and Vivekananda, and then it goes to Vivekananda and Nivedita. There have been people who don't like this. I've done this stuff on Nivedita because that's the legacy. You see, we don't know what is Vivekananda and what is her often, because she claims, and people say Vivekananda said, where actually she's saying. And that's why it's very important. We can't always distinguish, but I wanted also to make clear that this story was a story about Vivekananda placing himself between, in a sense, almost the provinciality of Bengal with the globalism of somebody, Nivedita, and trying to reconcile the two. And at the same time, show how emotion, and the body in particular, create ideas in ways that are really profound. We look at it the wrong way around. We tend to think the ideas come first. That's actually, I just don't think so. It's the people that really matter to us that spark us. That's why there are 2 chapters on the guru-disciple relationship and trying to create such a thing in a place like America where they have no idea what that could be. And they still don't really, I think. That's my personal view. It's very hard. It's a very different culture. So that's that question. You've given me a very good idea for Bhupendranath because I would love now to go back. Though I have to say, I think he was more a disciple of Nivedita.
What, sorry?
A disciple of Nivedita.
Yes.
At the end, he credits her in the book.
Yes.
And what's so disturbing is I have a feeling there's an Irishman involved.
That's right.
And one of the things what people don't know, and my book discusses at length in the last chapter, is that Nivedita, unlike Vivekananda, becomes very anti-Semitic at the end of her life. And I think she gets that through this man who claims to be an Irish nationalist, but is probably a fake. One of the problems of this story is these terrorists, and they were underground, and it's very hard to know who was slightly criminal and who was, you're all shaking your heads, you know this story. It's an underground, right? So, but that's a great idea. Vis-a-vis Tagore, yes, you could write it. I don't want to write it because the passions that would be unleashed by such a biography would be endless. But you could do it in a fascinating way. You could do it France with Roland. You could do it with Japan. You could do it with. You could just keep on going, and you could write something fantastic. There's one problem though with Tagore, in my view. Vivekananda is funny. Tagore is not. And I think if you're going to live with somebody for 10 years, it's really good to have humor. And that, what I missed out in my talk was what else did they like about him? They loved it that he was funny. He was teasing, and we don't understand the persuasive power of humor. Yeah. And I mean, we know the persuasive power of humor, but to really get the persuasive power of humor is very difficult. And of course, it's that lack of sanctimony in a Protestant culture again. I think that the thing about Bhupendranath and the book in Bengali, has it ever been translated? Do you know? It's a real pity because there's a whole body of critiques that emerge. They're European as well as the Global South. And it would be a fantastic book to write about all of them and why it is that people both love and hate America so very much.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. And it's very emotional, again.
Absolutely.
It's an emotional relationship. Should I let you go? Is there another question?
No, I think there are.
Oh, yes, fine. Yeah, a woman.
Thank you very much for a very enlightening talk. And my question is regarding this imperial world that you were trying to reconstruct. Thank you very much. So I'm a historian of the earlier part of the British Empire, so I'm very concerned with the 18th century, and Protestantism is a big force in colonialism.
Absolutely.
So I am interested to know how Vivekananda deals with this very idea of Protestantism being a colonizing force, and then does he find America a palatable ground because of the fact that they had freed themselves from the British quite early on? Is a connection of that kind also at work when you study this intellectual domain?
It's a great question. The Protestantism, one of the reasons why I undertook this was that it seemed to bring my personal worlds together. I'm American. In Oxford, we have an extraordinary number of South Asians, as you know, who are brilliant. And I could not understand how they knew Marx, Darwin, blah, 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 and everything else of their own. And it made me think about Vivekananda, what it means to be intellectually and aesthetically, even culturally, ambidextrous. But what is the strain of that? What does that mean in terms of one's psyche and development? It's very complex. So the question you ask is about Protestantism. And of course, he's at the Scottish Missionary College. And they're teaching him, lake poets, because they want to open their hearts, because they think that's the way for them to learn Jesus. And he knows the Bible virtually by heart. He's quoting it, during the Parliament and throwing it at them as a way of making them feel guilty for all their imperial stuff. It's great. Along with Shakespeare and all the other stuff. You can imagine. Okay. So the question you're asking me about America is really interesting because he arrives in New England and we tend, I think, to ally Britain and that Yankee culture, but it's not the same. And there is that civic ideal that they were the first to come away. So there's a kind of shared anti-colonial discourse. And yet, he is really unimpressed with the Protestantism. But he's more impressed with Unitarianism, and probably through Brahmoism, but he doesn't, I trace a bit the Brahmo connection, but not a lot. But that's what's going on. He's happy to be away from the British. However, when he arrives in Britain, he's happy to be with the British. And why is that? Because the Americans he ultimately finds quite superficial. And in the end, the people who come to help him are all British. And he also tries to meet all these Indian officers, and some of them have learned Sanskrit and this and that. And he feels he's connected. You know, that's that thing. There is an intimacy to the Anglo-Indian relationship. It's a love-hate thing. I mean, you know, especially for Bengalis. Am I stepping outside? Would you agree with that? You know, and of course he's amazed that in the end, those are the ones who come, not the Americans. The Americans give money, but Indians too much. So does that answer your question? Yeah.
How popular is Vivekananda in America?
Sorry?
How popular?
No, he's not. They know him from yoga, you know, from Raja Yoga, but that's it. And that really limits him. Can you speak up so everyone
So,
can hear?
wait for the microphone.
Yeah, so everyone can hear. It's hard.
Hello, ma'am. Thank you for your nice presentation and the lecture.
Bring it closer to the mouth.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay. I'm student of Ramakrishna Mission Vivekananda Educational and Research Institute. I'm a master degree student of rural development. Now, first of all, thank you for your nice presentation and lecture. My question is that in this present context, and when this globalization has spread out in all over the world, and the motto or the aim was the Vivekananda study that to provide spirituality to the West and bring the material to the world, to India. Now, but in this situation, we have seen that there are different organizations. There's Isha Foundation or ISKCON. They are so much prominent in Western. So where the Ramakrishna Mission is lacking, and you have mentioned that how much he influenced, but his fame is not that much. So this is my question. And why? And the second question is that you termed Ramakrishna as semi-literate. This is why.
As what?
Semi-literate. So why this is?
Why semi-literate? Okay, that's a good question too. The first one is ISKCON. Okay. I think that Vivekananda's influence. Can you hear me? I think. What?
Can you
It's not
raise the
great.
volume?
Yeah, it's not great.
Hello?
Hello?
Yeah.
Better. Yeah. I think that Vivekananda's influence is not in terms of organization. Just like he said, he was not concerned with church building. And the Vedanta societies are not churches, they're places for discussion, really. ISKCON is a big, powerful, highly funded movement, both here and around the world. It's something completely different. What I see as Vivekananda's influence is not through these institutions, and that if we continue to look only at institutions, then we lose sight. He is the door opener, in my view, both to much of what would be called, New Age stuff, but also many other serious forms of spiritual and ecumenical discussion all over in many parts of the world. And I think that's the difference. I don't think you have to feel bad that it's not like ISKCON. Maybe there's a discussion within the order about whether or not it should be more like that. I'm sure there is. But I think, it's something different. And there was that openness from the beginning that he had when he brings the Gita and Thomas à Kempis as a young man. This business of having two manuals from two different traditions is a rare thing, for sannyasin. Not many would do that, I think, in that time period.
Semi-literate.
Oh, semi-literate, sorry. There's one point which I read in one of the missions books that he's talking about Latu, Plato. And he says, he didn't even know his letters, and I taught him. I think that Ramakrishna went to school enough to know such things, and that's why I call him semi-literate. Ramakrishna was not a reader. That he's not. But Vivekananda was the first one to say that he was the true Jnani and that Vivekananda, was the Bhakta. You see, it's always about the inversion. It's what appears to be, but the wisdom of Ramakrishna does not come from books. And of course, we have those famous interactions in the Kathamrita when Vivekananda is reasoning excessively, and Ramakrishna says to him, "You're reasoning, I don't like it." It's very Ramakrishna.
Oh, one final question, please, if it's a short question. Yeah.
Okay. The technology is great, except when it
Hear
doesn't
me?
work.
Yeah. Hi. Hi, I'm Anshuman. I am a writer and a communications manager. I've got your book to get signed by you, please.
No problem.
Yeah. So, thank you for your lecture. I have a question. Could you talk a little more about Vivekananda's relationships, the kind of relationships? Now, you spoke about his relationships with women in America, and in the book you talk about quote unquote male intimacy, and we know about the deep relationship between Ramakrishna and Vivekananda. So, and you do say that it's non-sexual. So, could you talk a little bit about like whether they were totally spiritual or it can be misinterpreted? Could you talk a little more about that?
Well, it's hard for me to explain, but it's not what I was concentrating on. Do you see what I mean? I mean, there is no record. There's record of a true love story, but all love stories are not necessarily sexual, you know? And there are traditions, Indian traditions, that are not understandable to most Westerners. See, to me, what is the most interesting aspect of Ramakrishna's ecstatic love for Vivekananda is that it's a means of breaking down his barriers. And the other thing is that by becoming the baby, Vivekananda says, "I thought he was a brain sick baby." By being the baby, Ramakrishna inverts the vision of the guru as the father and the director. But by being the baby, as he is in Kali's lap, the connection is putting the demand on Vivekananda, who's the parent. He makes him the parent. And that's what Ramakrishna does all the time. He inverts everything that we think of as ordinary, and he makes something new out of it. Why I find that so moving, even though it's not my tradition, is that when you're a baby, that's the universal. That's the universal state. It's before family transforms you, before caste, before community, before culture, and before language. And that's why he insists on that relationship. So from a very early on, there's a lot on Vivekananda's shoulders. And if you want to be more instrumental in thinking about it, Ramakrishna, again, is very savvy in picking a man like Vivekananda, who he knows can travel the world. He certainly can't. He doesn't want to. It's something very different. So the form of love, what is this love? I mean, it's very hard to know. You know, we cannot know from the documents. We do not know. We only have for Ramakrishna, we have for Sharada is a second-hand account written by other Bengali intellectuals. So we have to be careful in what we say is going on. But there's certainly no doubt in my mind that when Vivekananda talks about Ramakrishna, he talks about him as somebody who loved him even more than his parents. And given how much his parents loved him, that must have been a lot. Yeah, it was a life-transforming love.
Thank you. Thank you very much. A little while ago, Professor Ruth Harris had asked you people whether she should let you go. I'm just reversing the question now. We have held her captive for an hour and 45 minutes, and she has held us captivated for an hour and 45 minutes. So should we let her go now? Yes, please. So please join me in giving her a big hand. And to continue keeping us in good humor, which she credited Vivekananda with, there is a cup of tea outside. Thank you very much. Good night.